Yeah, they would hear the things that were said at the meetings, and I would say that there's a fellowship to it, and it's very centrally a program. It's a way of life. It's in let's see, I think if I could say it briefly, it's a way of taking stock of yourself, taking inventory. If you make a mess, you clean it up. If you hurt someone, you make up for it. You it's a life of service, sort of. So you carry the message to newer people, to other people. So I think they were watching as I was sort of living this life of principle and service.
Welcome in to Menfolk Journeys, the podcast of great conversations with men. I'm your host, Chris Foster, and we're going to explore how we wear this beautiful and confusing mantle of manhood in the 21st century. Look, I get it. In public life, a lot of men are knuckleheads. But in private life, we can be thoughtful and we can be reflective if we have the right conversation, if we feel comfortable talking about our story. And we all have a great story to tell. And we can all learn from those stories. We can learn about who we've been, who we are, and who we want to be. And that's why we're going to have this conversation, so we can learn from other men just like us. And tonight, we're going to have a conversation with my friend Tim. Tim has set a course in his life that has a specific perspective and kind of I wouldn't say a rule book, but a philosophy of living that he charted early in his adulthood, and it's carried him through his entire adulthood, and it's made his children more successful. Great man, great story. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Welcome in to Menfolk Journeys. All right, so Tim, welcome in.
Thanks, Chris.
Appreciate it. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
All right. I am a 58-year-old man, married 33 years. I have two boys. They are 26 or almost 26 and almost 29. They're grown and gone and taking care of themselves. I am a psychiatrist in private practice in San Diego, and I grew up in Mississippi.
Great. What's interesting is you said just off the bat, you say your sons are grown and gone and taking care of themselves. What does that actually feel like to state that about the sons that you've raised?
It feels great. Like we talk about the empty nest, which is when they sort of leave the house, but it's probably a more important landmark to me when they've left the nest and they've got their own nest and they're sort of fully self-sufficient. Something, I certainly wondered about when they were little. Are they going to grow up and be okay? There's a lot of trouble to be had in the world, and they are. And so that's a great satisfaction.
That's fantastic. That it's almost as if this first stage of life or a stage of life is kind of mission accomplished.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's interesting now that they're older and you're older, and I'm sure you think about the relationship you have with them and your fatherhood to their sonhood and their sonhood to your fatherhood. It seems like that's a special relationship. And clearly, your dad is still alive. Is that correct?
That's right.
So it's an interesting thing. You've got 3 generations of these men. And do you sense that now that they're out on their own, that the relationship with you is different than it was 10, 15 years ago, and they see themselves more as young men starting on their own life, and they maybe see you now as not just dad, but also as a man who made his own life?
Yeah, it's definitely, the fact that they no longer depend on me for anything. They don't need money from me. They make their own decisions. They sometimes seek a little advice, but mostly they're kind of independent. So yeah, it seems like it's radically different than when they were in high school even.
So what kind of advice do they ask you for?
So let's see. Um, Stuff about like financial advice sometimes, medical advice, like do I need to go to the ER for this, that kind of thing.
Or just put some ice on it or put some butter on your wound.
Right. Yeah.
That's
Exactly.
hilarious. So your dad is still alive. So if you're 58, he's at least older than 60 years old. Um,
Yeah, he's
and
96.
96.
Yeah.
Congratulations, Pop. That's fantastic. Now, are you guys close? Do you have a special relationship?
Um, I don't know if I'd say we're close. There's a lot that's unsaid, probably. Um, some that is said, but he sired 10 kids and spread himself pretty thin. And when I was growing up, he worked a ton. So he set this sort of great example for a work ethic. And he's sort of really a self-made man. Came from a pretty poor family in Louisiana and put himself through college and med school. So I watched what he was doing, and I learned a lot of my work ethic from him. But he was just gone a lot. And then my youngest brother is 36, so he was born when I was 22, and so he had little
Wow.
kids. He was, very very full with little kids into my uh, middle age almost.
Sure. So that's well, Tim, that's a full generation. I mean, you could have been your brother's father with a
Yeah,
22-year age gap.
yeah.
Um, so actually, that's really interesting. Where you started your young adulthood at 22, young men are in this interesting cusp of life, right? They're kind of beginning their own journey. They know that they're no longer children. Some 22-year-olds are somewhat more dependent on home than others. Seems to me though,
Mhm.
you're saying, gosh, my dad was really invested in these young kids. I'm 22. Did you feel like you had to start making it on your own at 22?
I was making it on my own at 17, so
Mm,
my own with Uncle Sam. Uh, with Uncle Sam's help, I went to the Naval Academy. That was fully paid for. Then I went to medical school on a scholarship, and so I was not financially dependent after the age of 17.
that's fantastic. Not very many young men can say that. For Naval Academy, was that a call to service, or did you find that as a ticket out with that full independence?
I did not have my eyes very wide open. I really didn't even know what I was getting into. I didn't know much about it. How I got to the Naval Academy was um, when I was a freshman. There was a senior at my high school who got an appointment to the Naval Academy, and they presented it to him at the award ceremony. It looked really kind of grand, and so I mentioned it to my dad and his buddies on the golf course, and they said, "Oh, you got to go to the Naval Academy." I didn't even know what it was, and
Oh, you got to go.
so I looked at the application. It was due like junior year, which is really early. So I went through all that paperwork. They sent me a ton of paperwork. I filled it in. I got physical exam, physical fitness test, and all that. By the time I was done with that, I was tired of college applications and didn't fill out another one. So I had one
Wow.
one college application, and that's where I went.
I love that story. Right.
Yeah.
And did you, was it what is the sense at the time, Tim, where you were like, this is the road that I'm taking? And if this door closes or if this road crumbles, I'm mixing my metaphors, I know. But if this kind of doesn't happen, I don't know what I'm going to do. Or were you pretty convinced and sure that you were going to get into Naval Academy?
Um, so it was kind of late in my senior year when I got the final approval, and I was starting to get nervous.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe April, and so I started making calls to other schools. Where, so I wasn't exactly, I wasn't sure I was getting in. But I also wasn't thinking, what if I don't? I wasn't thinking. I just had an application in. Let's see what happens.
That's hilarious. You started to make calls. Hey, I know applications were due a number of months ago, but
Yeah.
so did your interest in medicine after Naval Academy um, bec- was that inspired by your dad's medical career?
Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm. And I think that when I look at kind of emulating and modeling, what your dad does and learning from your dad. Like you said, even though he necessarily wasn't physically around and he was gone a lot, working a lot, had younger kids, it seems to me, though, that these lessons of work or even the journey and a vocation really had a deep impact on you as you were growing up.
Yeah, absolutely.
And are you sharing that with your sons now? Are they looking at you? And do you think that they look at how you lived your life in a way that they want to model theirs after?
Not in any sort of following in footsteps kind of way. And, my father never expressed any expectation that anybody go to medical school.
Hmm.
And I was the only one of my siblings who did. I never expressed an expectation that my kids go to, go into the military or go into medicine, and neither one of them did either of those things. I
Hmm.
had, I'm veering slightly off of your question, but it was a pretty pivotal moment with one of my sons. Um, I did have the living in California. They were both born in California. I just got this idea that Cal Berkeley would be the place for at least one of my kids to go. And so
Uh-huh.
when my younger son was doing his college applications, he applied there, and he'd been hearing it since he was 5. Um,
Cal Berkeley, son, it's a great school. It's one of the
yeah, and so
classic UCs, University of
yeah,
California standard bearer.
yeah, we watched football games and all that, and so I knew something was up when he opened his email and said, "Shit, I got in."
That's
So we
interesting.
and we went up there, and I'm looking around and said, "Yeah, this is it. This is fantastic." And we put down a deposit, and then we went to UCSB, and he
A
said, "No, this is
University of
Santa
Santa
Barbara."
Barbara.
Yeah, he said, "I'm going here," and I was really, really proud that he had the initiative on his own to go against this expectation that I had put out there, or not expectation, hope maybe.
Hmm.
And it was absolutely the best choice for him. He graduated in 4 years, and he's doing great now. And he was very happy at UCSB. And
Yeah,
I think he wouldn't have fit well at Berkeley.
you know what? And he probably knew he wouldn't fit well at Berkeley either.
Hmm.
Like he knew it, right? If he
Yeah,
goes to Berkeley and tools around, and then goes to University of Santa Barbara and tools around, you get a sense and a feeling of what the best fit is.
yeah. I hadn't thought of it, but he grew up in Southern California, and he just didn't like the trees. The trees in Northern California are not Southern California trees.
Uh-huh. Well, it's a different atmosphere, right? It's an
Yeah,
unfamiliar, it's a completely different vibe. And I think that, you know, growing up in Southern California, very different than growing up in Mississippi,
for sure.
right? Um, I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, small town in, Southwest Pennsylvania. Great place to grow up. My daughters grew up in Southern California, totally different. As you started to think about as your kids were growing up, did you think that, man, this is California grow up? This is totally different than my experience. Were you curious about how that would affect your sons?
Yeah, well, I was very conscious of that from the time they were born because I had mixed feelings about Mississippi, and some of there were some things that I wasn't so pleased with Mississippi about. I really enjoyed growing up there. I say it was a Tom Sawyer existence, just
Hmm.
utter freedom, wild. But yeah, so I was just thinking when my kids were little that they're Californians. They'll be Californians their whole lives, which is California was like another planet from Mississippi. Like when I was growing up, no one really lived in California, um, so it was crazy. And I remember we took my older son to Louisiana, where my wife's from, when he was less than 2, and he saw rain for the first time. Essentially, he hadn't essentially seen rain here, and he was
Right.
just marching around in mud and puddles, having the time of his life. He's like, this is novel,
Right. It's another world. I think you're right in that California is a different world, um, because it's kind of a fantasy if you don't live here.
hmm
You see it, you hear about it. You assume everybody surfs and all the girls are ditzy, which isn't true, by the way. But there's a mystique about it. There's not really a mystique about Columbus, Ohio, or Akron, right? There's not like this fantasy or idyllic perspective of Boise, Idaho. But there is of California, Los
Hmm.
Angeles, San Diego, Santa Barbara. Um, as you were conscious of it, it's hard for your sons to be because it's all they know, right? So they're going to take it for granted. When they go visit other places, do they know that they're from California? Do they feel that?
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. My older son lives in Portland, and he's kind of taken to Portland. He's a Portlander now,
Hmm.
but he knows he's from California, from Southern
Yeah,
California.
yeah, from Southern California. And what was interesting about when my girls were growing up, they went to a high school where there was no single ethnic majority in the high school. Very diverse. And that's what they're used to, right? That's what they feel is comfortable and normal in the world. So even that changed their perspective of how they go about it. And, our relationship with them is different because it is in California versus someplace else. Um, and when we were coaching them through their perspective, I think sometimes it's hard where, as a parent, you look at a child and you want to open them up and you want to show them other aspects and other ways to live. But it's very hard if you grow up and stay in one place, because I'm assuming that you didn't leave. Like your kids grew up and only grew up here in California, in San Diego.
Yeah, they lived in San Diego their whole lives between two houses 1 mile apart between the two houses, but we traveled a lot. We took them to Switzerland. We took them skiing. We had annual passes at Disneyland, which is still Southern California, but it's it's not San Diego. And took them to Mississippi and Louisiana.
Okay,
Uh, they got a taste of some other places.
that's cool. Now, is your dad living in Southern California as well?
No, he's in Mississippi.
Oh, he stayed.
Yeah.
That is interesting. Um, so, how often do you get to see him?
Um, Maybe once a year. Um, Sometimes it's a couple of years. Sometimes it's twice a year.
Okay. Okay, and as that distant, and I know that you said you weren't super close growing up because he was very busy with the other children. Are you finding that you're getting closer to him as you're getting older and as he's getting older, or is it about the same as it was?
Well, and now we have the issue of very strong political differences. Uh,
Oh,
so that so that's an interesting. At times, it can be a wedge, but we have our range of topics that we can discuss with enjoyment. We try
uh
to stay
huh.
on those topics.
Isn't that interesting? How I think we're challenged these days about having political conversations or social conversations that can be amicable, even if there's a disagreement. And this your story of kind of moving or staying away from those topics, that's not uncommon. Since
Yeah.
2016, a lot of families have had these navigations. Um, as you start thinking about that, has it changed your approach to your own sonhood to your dad?
Hmm. Well, um, our political differences really surfaced probably 20 years before that, as
Mm,
I started to grow up and form my. I mean, I grew up kind of mirroring his political views and maybe some aspects of his worldview, but then I grew in kind of a very different direction. So, but yeah, it accentuated since 2016. But yeah, I'm trying to think what my sonhood was like before that. Um, yeah, I don't know. I think living so far away, um, and it's yeah, it's kind of like I left home and set up my own thing out here, and didn't my connections to back home were not that super strong.
I know what you mean. I came to San Diego when I was 22, and I never went back home ever. I visited it, handfuls of times, and the detachment I had from my first family was pretty profound, and I think it hurt their feelings too. But I'm 22 years old, and I was a brick when it came to thinking about my parents' feelings. Right, I was kind of consumed about starting my own way, and I've noticed that my sonhood changed as I got older, where I got a better understanding of him as not just my father, but as a man too. And what's funny is that my sonhood completely changed then when he had his stroke. So he had a stroke, significant stroke, about 20 plus years ago. It was a true life changing event. It completely changed his brain, completely changed his life, and set a different relationship that I had with him because he couldn't and we couldn't connect in the ways that we did in the past. And so I had to find new ways of connecting, even though I was a fully fledged adult trying to work hard, raise my own kids, build my own family. And so I think back about my sonhood during those years and how it is now. And my sonhood now that we're both a lot older is completely different. It's more of a caretaking sonhood. It's more of a inquisitive sonhood to see how he's doing. But the ask for advice, the discussions about life perspective, that sonhood relationship is completely gone. I'm curious, Tim. Do you think about your dad and your sonhood and how that's evolved now that he's 96?
Yeah, so the caretaking aspect is not so prominent because I have, I think, something like five siblings who live close to him, and they're pretty active in taking care of him. So it's already sort of covered by people who are on the scene. So
Mm-hmm.
there's not really he doesn't need anything from me. Um, as I think about it, though, I do write a check every month for him to have a single room at his. He's in a retirement home, and
Mm-hmm.
his what he had left of his money didn't cover a single room, so I chip in a little bit. But other than that, uh, he doesn't need me to attend to him. He doesn't need me to sort of administer to him because he's got other
Mm-hmm.
people doing that. So there isn't that pull. Um, and also, there's something about maybe the fact that I became independent at 17, that I didn't have that extended feeling of like when I would go home from college. Um, I was kind of by myself. Like he was like he was not there, so it was just using his house as a base to see my
Mm-hmm.
friends. So I think he was really proud that I went to the Naval Academy and then I went to medical school, and so he was very sort of emotional and enthusiastic at my graduations from those things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think this is maybe an story, illustrative of something. It's not all encompassing. But when I was a sophomore at the Naval Academy, I was sick of the all the discipline and the restrictions and the lack of freedom and all that. And the grass was looking pretty green at like other colleges. I was really conscious of not
Mm.
having a college experience. So I called my dad and I said, I think I'm going to quit the Naval Academy. And the deal was you could quit up until your second year, and if you quit after that, you owed them service as an enlisted man.
Mm.
So he didn't say anything. He got on the next plane to Annapolis, to Baltimore, Washington, and we went out and got hammered together. Never spoke about it. He got back on a plane, went home, and I didn't quit.
Wow. I love that story. I love that story. It's also it's a generation of men that didn't probably express feelings, didn't probably talk about missed opportunities. If your dad was a self-made man and had 10 children that he was working to support and a whole life to support, that's probably not something he talks about in terms of his fears, in terms of his uncertainties, in terms of his regrets.
I would say he doesn't have any fears, uncertainties, or regrets.
That is all well, good on him. Rare is the
His
man.
his worldview is the one right worldview. He has no
Oh,
regrets about anything.
that you know what? That is so interesting. That's very interesting. I think that there are few men that I've met who could say that, but that's maybe like either a type or a mold or just baked into his view of the world of real purposeful, approach to living.
Yeah, well, so I think so. There's a lot of that, and there's also, and God, I wonder about the possibility of his ended up hearing this. I think it's probably pretty slim, but also maybe not a lot of self-reflection. Like he had two
Mhm.
marriages that he was my mother and then his second wife, and he just was head over heels from day one. And both marriages kind of fell apart for the same reasons. And both wives left him, and he didn't want them to, but they did. And through all that, I don't think that he would say that he did anything to contribute to the failure of the marriages.
Roger. So it's almost where, and even that it might be generative or might be just him, that lack of reflection, lack of awareness, lack of wanting to dive into those depths, even though those are challenging places to go. He's like, I'm moving forward.
Yeah,
That's interesting. So you guys got hammered. You never talked about it at all. And when he left, did you think, well, that was the message? Or did you just kind of just wake up the next day and do what you did before?
I think I took in what I took in was it was really important to him. Like he had a lot emotionally at stake that he wasn't going to verbalize about having
Right.
a son at the Naval Academy.
Right. And maybe not just even having a son that he could tell other people, but it might have been you.
No.
Like you said,
Hmm.
he had lots of kids. You were the one who was on a path to becoming a self made man. You
Hmm.
have to make yourself if you go to the Naval Academy. You're putting yourself through it, period. And then you owe the government service. There must have been
Hmm.
a tremendous amount of pride that he felt in you.
Yeah.
And he saw that. That's wonderful. That's a
Hmm.
great story. That's a great
Hmm.
story.
Hmm.
All right. So, Tim, you have an incredible experience with your dad. You guys fly out, you guys both get clonked. Clearly, it's an emotional moment because you can sense from him that that's how he's expressing his emotions. He's sharing this with you, he's super proud of you. And you wake up. And did that have a sense of how you wanted to change your life or live your life after, getting drunk with your dad? Did that change something in you?
Well, so that wasn't the first time I'd drunk with him, and in fact, I kind of grew up with a pretty heavy alcohol culture with my both my parents and my older siblings.
Hmm.
So it was kind of a that would have been kind of typical. Um,
Hmm.
that was kind of meeting him where he was, and
Right.
actually by that point I was this is very much where I was as well. So I'd kind of picked that up from a very early age.
Hmm. And then did that change?
So let's see, that was near the end of my sophomore year at the Naval Academy, and I got sober in the summer between my sophomore and junior year. So probably that was probably 2 or 3 months from when I got sober, and I've been sober
Wow.
ever since. It's be 39 years next month.
C- Congratulations. Well done, you.
Thank you.
Um, so it's interesting is that you grew up in a drinking culture. As you grow up and you see that as a youngster and you think that that's just normal and what everybody does, you also see what happens to your parents when they are in a drinking culture. I remember times when, so my grandfather was like like old school alcoholic, and I remember what that was like, and I remember stories that my dad would tell of him, and so it has an effect on kids. I know it does. So again, congratulations on your sobriety. And then when you became a dad, you didn't have a culture of drinking in your household. You couldn't. You had a culture of sobriety. How do you think that changed your son's view of you? And how do you think that changed what you modeled to them?
Yeah, so that's all they ever knew of me from the very beginning. Like I was bringing my older son to AA meetings in a basket when he was 6 weeks old. Um,
Wow.
and they would when they were both little, I would bring them to meetings and they would have cookies and sit in the back and take
Huh.
in a little bit what was going on. So they grew up around that. My wife is a very normal drinker. She'll have a glass of wine a couple times a week. And so they it wasn't so they saw someone drinking normally and they saw someone not
Hmm.
drinking. And yeah, it's just all they ever knew about me.
What what was that conversation like with your wife, or what was the calculus you made to bring them to the AA meetings? That's, I think, unusual.
Actually, it's it's not terribly unusual. So some of it had to do with if she had something going on, um, and I needed to be the one. Like I needed to share the load, and I was going to be going to these
Sure.
meetings. So if I'm going, they're going. There's the idea of the cookies. They like that,
Do
and
you think?
I think
No, keep going.
and I also I think the people that were part of my fellowship and community, it was fun for me for them to see my kids.
Yeah, to share that. Absolutely. I was talking with another man, Scott Sutton. He's in episode 6, The Science of Uncertainty. And he and his son are actually on episode 13, I believe, about the transitions of father and his son. And he mentioned the fellowship. He's relatively recent in his sobriety. And that sense of fellowship was very welcoming and warm to him. I have not been to AA meetings, so I guess I would ask you, beyond the sobriety, there also seems to be a worldview of fellowship, maybe some spiritual overtones. Is that something that you wanted to share with your children as well, or do you think that as your kids grew up, they kind of got some of that by osmosis?
Okay, so yeah, they would hear the things that were said at the meetings, and I would say that there's a fellowship to it, and it's very centrally a program. It's a way of life. It's in let me think if I could say it briefly. It's a way of taking stock of yourself, taking inventory. If you make a mess, you clean it up. If you hurt
Mm-hmm.
someone, you make up for it. You it's a life of service, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
So you carry the message to newer people, to other people. So I think they were watching as I was sort of living this life of principle and service. But at the same time, we were involved in the Catholic Church from the time that they were born until into their teen years, probably. And they went to Catholic school from preschool through one of them through all the way through college, but the other through high school. And so they had
Mm-hmm.
a set of values and practices through that as well.
That's interesting. And one of the tenets of this show is how we wear this beautiful and confusing mantle of manhood, right? And a mantle is defined as a cloak, but it's also a responsibility that you pass from one to the next. And you were just talking about that kind of the service portion, the sharing portion, the mantle of responsibility to other people who are also going through this journey. Is that something you actively talked about with your sons as they were growing up, about that responsibility towards others?
Yeah, we did, and it was also another important organization that was part of their rearing was the Boy Scouts. They're both
Hmm.
Eagle Scouts, so they had very specific service projects both for the Scouts and for school, that they needed to do, and we would talk about the value of service and people who are less fortunate and how service makes life meaningful. So yeah, it was just very, very out there in our discussions.
Yeah, and it seems like it was part of the fabric of your family life too, because if your boys are in Eagle Scouts, that means that you and your wife are also in Eagle Scouts. Like you guys,
Pretty much. Yeah,
like it becomes a family affair.
for sure.
When you had your sons, can I ask how old were you when you had your sons?
Let's see, 29 and 32.
Okay, so late 20s, early 30s. Did you feel like you were ready for it? And I ask because um, it seemed to us as we had our kids, I was around the same age, like 20s, when we had our children, and it seemed like I guess this is the next thing we should be doing. Um, but I don't necessarily know that I actually was planning how I was going to parent. Did you feel ready for that moment, for that mantle now to be put upon you, knowing that your dad raised 10 kids and you had these two kids now, and it was your turn to do the breezing?
Yeah, so I couldn't wait, and my wife couldn't wait either. We were really excited to have kids. Um, and as far as planning, I don't know if I had a strategy. In fact, there are probably a lot of ways that I deviated from what you might call conventional fatherhood in terms of teaching certain lessons explicitly.
Hmm.
And part of that was I did not have a lot of parental supervision as a kid myself, so I didn't know. I hadn't been on the receiving end of that kind of guidance. I learned a lot of lessons the really hard way. Yeah, I didn't have a strategy. I remember whatever age they were, I would see parents of kids 3 or 4 years older and think, "Oh my God, how do they do that? How do you have like when how do you have kids that go to school in the morning? Like, what does that involve? Or
Right.
kids that are in high school, geez, driving. But they get older one day at a time, and so while at, at every stage of the game, the future looked really kind of mysterious and perplexing to me, but the present was always pretty pretty manageable.
I think that's very interesting that, and you just mentioned kind of the one day at a time
Hmm.
living. You mentioned earlier that AA is also kind of a lifestyle in terms of taking stock of yourself and calibrating and making amends and cleaning up messes. And you just said now, I think something interesting where the day to day was manageable, even though the future was unknown. Um, is that how you think you guys went through raising the kids? Is kind of like, oh, today's Tuesday. What happens on Tuesday? Well, we've got school, we've got pickup, we've got this, then we've got scouts, and then we'd go home and we've got dinner. That's Tuesday. Is that kind of how you and your wife managed family?
Yeah, I think so. Although I'd say that my wife had a very different upbringing. She had a very tight knit family. Her family, my family's back in Mississippi and hers is back in Louisiana. And as I drifted apart from mine, she was very, very tight with her mother and father until they both died. Um, and she also had a very different experience of being. She was probably much more uh, managed as a child. She was the youngest of
Mm.
five, only girl, and so she was really seen as this precious person who got a lot, like the lion's share of the attention, which is kind of the opposite of my situation. So she was a much more, um, she was more helicoptery than I
Okay.
was, and we disagreed all the way through about how much to get involved and kind of manage things. We never really settled that disagreement, but they eventually they grew up and flew, and they turned out all right with that, and now we don't have as much to disagree about.
Right, right. It's an interesting point. I can relate. I don't know if it's a father thing or maybe it's just a personality thing, but I can relate with that where the idea of letting them play it out. I remember our two girls were upstairs, they were kind of squabbling as siblings do, and my wife is an only child, and she was freaking out. She's like, "Are they gonna?" I was like, you just do, like, they have to work through. They have to understand how to get through this themselves without us being in the room and intervening. So, I get your point about disagreeing. We had those challenges too, and so now you said, okay. Um, your sons are kind of moving on and moving up. They don't ask for much advice. They maybe have some financial questions for you. Um, you know, I guess one of the things that I would ask is now they're young men. And I was talking to another conversation, my friend Jeff Wilbur, and he mentioned during a challenging divorce on one episode that he needed to show his son and daughter, quote unquote, how to be a man. I was like, all right, well, what does that mean? What does that mean for you when you say that, how to be a man? He says, well, to act with dignity and maturity when he didn't get something that he wanted. I was like, oh, okay, I get that. That's a way to kind of embody that spirit. Do you have conversations with your sons about being young men and kind of the responsibility of being a man?
Hmm. I don't know that it's maybe if I thought about that longer, I would something would come to mind. My first thought is that I'm not sure if that's exactly explicit. Not um, the question of being a man versus being an adult, like sort of gender specific. Being a man
Uh-huh.
is it's an interesting distinction. Um, but I talk a lot about adult responsibilities and adulting and you
Mm-hmm.
know my younger son has learned some lessons the hard way with like speeding tickets and parking tickets and losing stuff. It's like, yeah, that's what happens.
That's
These things cost.
yeah. No, that's interesting. And I think the reason that I was just curious about the becoming a man versus becoming an adult and there are lots of conversations in society now about gender roles and the like, and there are a lot of smarter people who've studied this and are more and more aware of kind of the discussions than I am. But my only perspective is that I had two daughters, right?
Mhm.
So with my girls, I saw a lot of young girls and a lot of young women around because their friends were girls and their friends are young women, and so I get exposed to that world and see life from a completely new perspective. With your two sons, especially if they were in Boy Scouts, it's a lot of young boys around, right? Yeah, I mean,
Mhm.
I'm sure you had times when the house was filled with young boys and the like. As you saw them go through that, I guess my question is, because I have a perspective of what I've seen from the young girls and young women that my daughters are friends with. Have you gained a perspective of the young men and young boys? How they're handling their growing up years these days. I'm curious. Do you have concerns? What gives you optimism? What kind of observations you have from seeing groups of young men grow up?
Hmm. Well, one thing that I was kind of struck by when the boys were in high school is how different male female relationships were than when I was in high school, and the
Mm,
girls seemed much more aggressive. It wasn't like the boys doing the chasing and the girls doing the playing hard to get kind of thing. So that was a whole like a pretty important dimension of my growing up years. It was just not part of the culture when they were growing up. Um, and yeah, I think so. My kids have had really quality friends. I've loved their friends up
hmm
to the present day. Like they just pick good people to hang around with. They gravitate towards good people. And maybe veering slightly off this question, but it's something I thought about a few minutes ago. Um, I didn't have to um, impose. I didn't have to direct very much because I very regularly I would get these indications that my kids were growing up to be very good men, young boys and young men with whatever we were doing. Like I would hear from
hmm
other parents, like, "Oh, your son was at our house. He's so polite." It's like, "Oh, my son," and 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 they're really polite and thoughtful. And I don't know, I don't remember telling them you need to be polite and thoughtful, but we
hmm
kind of lived with that as a value and they picked it up.
Yeah, you modeled it. I think that the world could use more polite and thoughtful young men. Um, and I think that what I am curious about is especially seeing, because there are a lot of young men not like your boys who are adrift, who are really questioning their place in the world. The traditional roles might not be what are thought of now in terms of what quote unquote to be a man looks like. I'm just curious if, you and your sons are having conversations like that, if they're aware of that, or if they are just kind of focused on building their own adult life and really haven't been exposed to young men who are adrift.
I think they've been adjacent to some young men who are adrift. Like they know they're some of the people they knew once upon a time. They hear stories about their kind of going off the rails, but I don't think anybody that is really close to them. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so somebody that they were, was in their inner circle who was adrift. I think pretty much there's one guy who stands out. He's going to be the officiant at my son's wedding in September, and he's on such an unorthodox path. His parents are really devoutly Catholic, and they had 5 kids, and um, he he didn't go to college. He's full of tattoos. He's a bartender. Sweetest guy you'd ever meet. Um, he's fine, and his parents know
Sure.
he's fine. And so it's some from a through a certain lens that's adrift, but he's not adrift. It just
No, there are lots of ways to be fine. Oh, congratulations on your son's upcoming wedding. That's
yeah.
fantastic.
Thanks.
And that actually gets me to a next a next part of the conversation, Tim. Um, so your son's getting married in September. There is clearly this transition that's happening now where they're up and out. Your son now is probably embarking on thinking about his own family and what that looks like.
Hmm.
Hopefully, as we start getting older, we've got some observations, and that the only thing that decades hopefully do for you is that you learn something along the way. Um, are you talking about your sons about these milestones as a big transition?
Well, I think it sort of goes without saying. I think um, yeah, like his getting married. He's obviously it was something he's been with this woman for probably 4 years, and so it wasn't anything that he rushed into. Um, And yeah, it seems just it's very clear to all of us in the family that this is a huge transition. My younger son is in a relationship that's like the best one he's ever had. We think she's the one. He thinks she's the one. And so it's very satisfying. And I think we say things to indicate that we're proud and we're very happy. Like that's one of the things I would most hope for my kids is they would grow up and have good relationships, and I'm very proud of the relationships they have. And I think we've modeled what it is to be in a marriage over the long haul, which pretty much no one else in my family has.
We'll be right back. That's interesting. So, no one in your family actually modeled a one house, one spouse kind of life.
Right.
Right. And you that's another reason why I think maybe your dad is so proud of you because you're able to take that approach to your everyday. So I guess now it's an interesting place for you personally, right? Beyond being a father of sons, what's next for Tim?
So let's see. So one thread of my life that we haven't talked about is my athletic life, triathlon. It started with running and then built in the swimming and the biking, and now it's back to the emphasis on the running. So I've done 3 Ironman triathlons. I will probably do another Ironman triathlon. Um, I've done 15 marathons, I think it is. I've done 4 of the 6 world marathon majors. I need Tokyo and London to get the 6 star medal. So that's one thing that's on the books, or not on the it's on
Sure.
the books. It's in the cards. So I've got those athletic pursuits and just
Hmm.
always wanted something to look forward to athletically. It's one thing. Professionally, I got involved in the local and then the national psychoanalytic professional organizations. Ran for president of the American Psychoanalytic Association twice. The first time I thought, um, well, I was close. I got some good exposure. Surely I'll get it next time against whoever the opponent's going to be. The next time, the opponent was the secretary of the association who had a lot more visibility than I did, and she
Mm-hmm.
won. And so now it's like I don't think I can run a third time. And I realized I'd spent probably 10 years thinking that was my future. So
Huh.
now I'm turning my professional interest to writing. Like I've got a paper submitted. I've got another one that I'm working on. I've been
Great.
asked to do a book review, and so I'm pivoting in my late 50s into being sort of a new psychoanalytic author.
That's fantastic. If you had sent me a bunch of text messages that I get from politicians, I could have chipped in and donated to your candidacy. So,
Yeah.
um, and I think that what's interesting about that to me, Tim, is it's really a focus on growth, right? Athletic growth in terms of goals, in terms of trying to reach those last two marathons to get the 6-star medal, right? Growth in terms of your publishing and your writing and pushing yourself forward. Is that something now that you feel like you're older, like you're giving yourself permission to focus on your own growth now that you've raised two sons and had been for so long focused on their growth?
Yeah. Well, I think let's see, how old were they? Trying to think how old they were when I did my first. When I did my first marathon, they were very young. When I did my first Ironman, they were probably um, 13 and 8. In any case, no, 13 and 14, 16. But yeah, so I was all along, I was sort of taking care of my own growth while raising them. And I don't think I
Mm-hmm.
was, I think that, I think they would attest that I was pretty involved while taking care of my own growth. I went on all their Boy Scout um, campouts and stuff like that. So, but yeah, it's a level up in terms of the freedom. So it's been several years now. So like when the youngest one went to college, which is now 7 years ago. So I've had 7 years of having
Mm-hmm.
just tons of freedom. So it doesn't feel like it's interesting to hear it as a question about like now, like it's been a long time.
It has been a long time. No, it's been in this stage. I think that, as I get older and I start thinking about what's important to me now is definitely different than what it was X number of years ago, and maybe will change. Do you feel the same way, or are you thinking that what's important to you, what has always been important to you, in terms of physical fitness, in terms of these goals? Because it's not just fitness, right? When you train for a marathon or an Ironman, it's not just doing it to stay fit. You actually are preparing for an event. And maybe the event drives that fitness and drives the discipline to be fit, but it's towards a goal, right? It's a
Sure.
very specific thing you're training for.
Oh yeah, yeah. There's a lot that goes into the training, and then on race day to race as smart as possible. So that's something. And I've gotten slower in recent years. I peaked at age 47. That was 11 years ago. So now I'm learning to have a different relationship. Like for many years, it was always what will be my fastest time ever on different distances and races. And now I've probably had my fastest times at everything. So
Mm.
now it's like the most recent marathon I did was Chicago Marathon last year, and I was just absolutely thrilled with being able to kind of pull the performance out of myself. It was sort of the max I could have done that day, that year. And the fact that I finished very close to as fast as I started, I, that was the challenge to know how to ration my energy so that I felt
Hmm.
felt good at the end.
It seems to me, and I'm sure the answer, well, I'm assuming the answer will be yes, but it seems to me you're very intentional and thoughtful about how you prepare and set up a discipline for yourself ahead of these events.
Yeah, and I have a coach, so I'm thoughtful, and I'm collaborative. I have somebody who's an expert who,
Hmm.
I treasure that relationship. This is a woman who lives in Pennsylvania, and she feeds me my workouts, and we have these exchanges, these about how it went and what's next and all that. And I really enjoy having someone do do some math and some thinking about what I'm capable of, and then feeding it to me, and then I do it, and oh, what do you know? I was capable of that.
That's fantastic. Is it a fair analogy to say that it's almost like a sponsor?
Yeah, yeah.
Because you have that person with you
Hmm.
looking out for you. So I guess I've got a question for you. I don't know if you've thought about it. With all the learning you're getting, are you thinking about maybe being a coach to someone else?
So I wouldn't be an athletic coach. I do a lot of teaching and supervision. I do a lot of mentoring professionally.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's interesting. I hadn't thought, and I don't think I would want to turn to being. I have friends who are triathlon coaches, um, who are my age or younger. But yeah, that doesn't grab me.
Sure. Just wondering because I think that that analogy of having a coach, having a sponsor, having someone help guide your pursuit can't do it be anything but helpful. I think if you have someone to kind of watch
Mhm.
as you're moving along, and so your dad is a grandfather.
He's a great
You
grandfather.
may
Yeah.
great grandfather. He's a great
Hmm.
grandfather. You might be a grandfather in X number of years if your children choose to do so and they're blessed. Do you have a vision of your grandfatherhood?
Yeah, I want to make the effort to. I don't know. They're going to live where they're going to live, and I don't know where that's going to be. And so wherever they are, it's on me, on us
Hmm.
to go there, and we will prioritize going there with some regularity, um,
Mm-hmm.
to have a relationship with them as they grow up. And I think we're young
Yeah.
enough that we we ought to be able to see, if everything goes a certain way, we should be able to see our grandchildren get married,
Mm-hmm.
and so we want to have not just relationships with child grandchildren, but adult grandchildren.
Yeah. Of course you do. Of course you do. Well, Tim, this has been fantastic. I appreciate you spending the time. I've got a couple more questions before we wrap up. One question I would have is what book would you recommend to a young man in his 20s and then an older man in his 40s and 50s?
Oh, so that would so if it weren't in this context, if you had said, "Hey, know any good books?" I would have a lot. I read voraciously, and so I'm not sure. Like it would be, yeah. Like my first answer has really nothing to do with this context. Like the one of my favorite books that I've ever read, uh, that I actually gave to my father, and he loved it. Uh, is called Destiny Disrupted. It's by Tamim Ansari. It's the history of the world through Islamic eyes. And
Hmm.
I loved it so much because I had never thought about it in that way, and how we grew up so Western centric, American centric, and from another perspective, they're looking at us, um, and they're looking at themselves. And when we had, um, the medieval times when there was a certain amount of stagnation in education and technology, they were having a golden age.
Right.
Um, so, what does that have to do with manhood or fatherhood or anything we've talked about? I don't
Actually,
know,
you
but
know what? It has everything to do with it because it has to do with perspective. I think that if you're able to see the world in a different way and you embrace a vision that isn't your natural, that isn't your own, it
hmm
can't help but make you a little wiser and more caring and more interested in other people, and that has to be a good thing. So I love that. Destiny disrupted. Wonderful.
Yeah.
My last question for you, Tim, is who is someone that you know that I don't know that I should meet?
Hmm. So I don't know if you mean, people talk about like someone you should meet, or it would be great for you to meet, or
No,
I, yeah.
someone you think I should meet that I don't know, but you know.
Huh. I'm having a hard time with that question because I'm not sure how to orient myself to it. Like
Okay.
here's a related question that I'm stuck on is like when people say if you could have dinner with anybody from history, Winston Churchill or
Sure.
Abraham Lincoln or something. So I'm thinking in this kind of grand fantasy kind of thing, but really more realistically, we're talking about somebody, a friend of mine that I could introduce you to. Um,
That
and
you think that I should meet, that I would learn something from.
yeah, yeah, I guess I would have to say I would get back to you on that, but then it won't be on the podcast. And I don't have
That's fine.
I don't have an answer, but maybe I'll have you one for you later.
That'd be great. I'd love to get that answer because I think that one of the things that I'm also trying to do is as we start, as we get older, is expanding a connection of people who have good conversations, who can have good conversations, talk about things that are meaningful and momentous, and so that other folks can learn from it, which is why we're here and why I'm doing the podcast. So if we can all learn from other people's journeys, maybe we'll all get better together. And that's
Hmm.
the point of it. That's the point. So this is fantastic. And this was a great conversation. Tim, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. And there's one other thought that I had earlier in the conversation that I would love to interject here if I could,
Of
and it has to
course.
do with fatherhood. And one thing I've realized, I don't. This might be slightly more long-winded than I want it to be. Uh, my brother's kids, we have strong genes. My brother's kids look identical to him. We look identical to our father, but my wife's genes are stronger. So my kids don't look like me. They don't look like my side of the family, and that's the visual. But also, I don't feel that these are like created from me, and I don't feel when I see what men they've become. When I see there's a lot there that I didn't put there that I'm really pleased with, and so it's humbling to realize what they have learned has so vastly exceeded anything that I could have taught them, and that's very satisfying.
That's wonderful. Man, isn't that what you hope?
Yeah,
What you hope is that we become the best of ourselves so that they become the best of us. Like
and the
they
best of
become,
things outside of us.
that's right. That's right. The best things of not only better than us, but better than and becoming outside of us, more than us.
Yes, absolutely.
Satisfaction indeed. And
Yep.
congratulations and well done, Pop.
Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Tim. Have a great evening.
You too. Thanks, Chris.
Well, all right, Tim. What an extraordinarily accomplished man. And I love that story of how he figured out the relationship with his dad and still figuring it out. Of course, it's ongoing. And figuring out how to be that father to his own sons. And that transition from sonhood into fatherhood and the types of things he's trying to teach his own boys who are now young men. And a way of approaching life that has a discipline, has a perspective that was rooted and driven by his experiences as a young adult and a young man. And I wonder, what are those things in our young adulthood that shape the next 20, 30, 40, perhaps even all of our adulthood? What are those things in childhood that shape that? When do we have these perspectives that really codify the way we're going to live for our life? It's different for everyone. So what did we learn from Tim? We learned that having a perspective, a worldview, can shape everything about how you live your life moving forward. And I love his idea of having not just a sponsor, but also a coach. We can all get some coaches and get some mentors, and you don't have to be an AA to have a sponsor, right? You can all have sponsors that help you get through, bounce ideas. Maybe it's someone that keeps you accountable for how your life unfolds. It's not a bad idea. Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and I'd love for you to be a guest. Tell some other menfolk about it. We'd love you to be a guest. Go to menfolkjourneys.com and book a conversation, because you have a great story to tell, and we can all learn from your story too. Word bid Falarid.